So this is something I've kind of been working on alongside our Ezekiel stuff. I've been planning on it and kind of trying to get some things situated for it. I wanted to do as we were kind of getting into I don't want to call it a political season, but to some degree we're going towards an election here. There's a lot of stuff going on in our culture, in our country, and I've been reading through this and I just keep seeing these parallels as I'm looking at the Passion Week and I'm studying the kind of the politics around it, what actually was going on in the society and the culture and the government that actually set the stage for the crucifixion and all the events associated. And so there's a lot of similarities here, just a lot of similarities with what we're seeing going on in our country and what the state of the government was and what the ruling class was doing at the time of the crucifixion. And so I think you'll see these things. So I don't know how long this is going to take. I'm thinking maybe 8 weeks to go through this. Kind of the different things. I'm taking it a week at a time. I don't want to say 8 and then it's 10 or it might be 6. I don't know, but we're going to get through it in the right amount of time. And the goal with this is to go through and look at the events that led up to the crucifixion and what was going on in the government, with the Pharisees, the temple. Why did Jesus irritate these guys the way he did? I mean, we kind of all know the generics, but let's get into what was going on if you were to look at it in a political textbook, kind of like what happened. So we're going to look at the politics of the Passion, and I think what we'll find is you'll see the big problems that pop up with people in power, with elites, with government, with the little guy, with the common folk, and you'll see that it hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Hasn't changed 2,000 years. So that's the goal of this, is to kind of go through. So today we're going to do kind of a little introduction. I need to introduce you to the players. We need to kind of set the stage a little bit. Next week, we're going to look at the temple in the probably the deepest way we've ever seen it. I'll bet you'll come next week, and after you leave, you'll go, I did not know how the temple functioned and ran and worked. We always just think of the main building. Priest goes in, does the sacrifices. That's the sanctuary. The temple complex was massive. It was a quarter of the whole land mass. There was a lot of things happening. And so next week, we're going to look at that entire land mass and see what was happening and where was Jesus in that and what was going on and what were the politics going on in that compound, because there was a lot of stuff happening. So that'll be next week when we get through that. So today we're going to kind of talk and set the stage a little bit on some of this. And so I'm going to call this the beginning of the end. Obviously we're going towards, it's the Passion Week, so it ends with the crucifixion and then obviously the resurrection. But we're going to set everything up before that. We want to kind of look at the events that led to this. Okay, so that's where we're going to be. So let's do a quick, brief history lesson on Israel and Jerusalem. Okay, they had been occupied for years in Israel, right? I mean, they had a lot of conquering groups come in. Now, you think where we were at in Ezekiel, the Babylonians had come in and taken over, and then eventually they went back to the land. And then when you had these other empires, the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks and all these others, they ended up breaking up after Alexander the Great. That's the Greeks. And his kingdom broke into 4 groups. So the Seleucid Empire was the 4 captains of Alexander the Great's army. They broke up, and they broke the kingdom into 4, and the Seleucids were in the north. Okay, remember when we talked about Antiochus IV, who came in and stopped them worshiping in the temple, and he set up an altar to Zeus in the temple and desecrated it. That was the Seleucid Empire. They came in and they basically took over Israel and occupied it during the time of the Greeks. Okay, so this is many years after the Babylonians. They fought back. Okay, they battled against the Antiochus IV. That was the Judas Maccabeus. That was the revolt where he said, we're going to fight back. You can't desecrate the temple. And they basically beat them. And they were able to clean up the temple. And this is when they had the first celebration of Hanukkah and the lights that never went out. And all of these things happen. And then after that, the Romans take over. So they come in and they finally get some freedom. Then who comes in? The Romans come in and they just take over the whole place. And so now during Jesus' time, right as we're getting started with this, who's in charge of the nation of Israel? The Romans. Okay, the Romans have conquered basically the whole world. They're the biggest group out there, and they have now taken over and are in control of Israel. Okay, Judea, this area, they put their own people in charge. However, in Israel, because it was a unique, I guess, government and political place, they had the biggest temple complex of anywhere in the world. Their temple was the biggest and the grandest of all temples in every nation across the planet. The Romans knew this, and so they also knew that this was important, and so they came in and said, we've got to allow the Jews to kind of run themselves to some degree. We're going to oversee them, but we're going to make sure that we don't disrupt and create this religious revolt. We want to kind of keep them satisfied. And so they put Herod in a position of power, okay? And he, being Jewish, was able to oversee that. You have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and you have all these groups. Now, there was a lot of religious groups in Judaism. We always hear about just the Sadducees and the Pharisees. There was a lot of groups. And they all had different views on how the law was supposed to be interpreted, how strict certain things were supposed to be applied. They had like denominations, kind of like churches do today. And they had big ones that had huge followings, and they had some little small ones. The Pharisees were the largest group. Okay, so when we hear Pharisees, or the party of the Pharisees, you have to think this is just the largest group in the region. This is the largest religious sect in Israel. Okay? What they believed is what the vast majority of people believed. So it'd be kind of like having one denomination, say Baptist, that was huge. That's the biggest one. That's kind of what they're talking about. Okay? So the Pharisees were part of, we could say, maybe a ruling class because they're the largest group. When you have the numbers, think about politics. You know, who do they want? They always break everything down into this group, the male vote, women, minorities, and they do these things. They want the biggest group, right? Because that's how you keep power. Hence why the Pharisees were involved in the decision making. They were the biggest group. They had the biggest following, the most people a part of it. Okay? This is the world at the time when this stuff is starting, when Jesus is born and when he's kind of starting his ministry. This is what's going on. Now, do you have other groups besides the Pharisees? Yeah. You got the Sadducees. Okay, those are the two big ones. Okay, got the Essenes. You have all these different groups that were kind of in debate over certain pieces of the law, of Old Testament. Remember, they don't have a New Testament yet. All they have is the law of the prophets. They have the Torah, the first 5 books. And that's what they debated. How should this be applied? How should this be interpreted? One of the big ones was the resurrection. They had debates over this. In fact, that's a big difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You always remember Sadducees because they didn't believe in a resurrection, so they were sad, you see. Get it? Okay. That's how I remember it. They don't believe in a resurrection. And so Sadducees, Pharisees did believe in the resurrection. We'll talk about that as we get going. Let's talk about the Pharisees. We need to look at kind of the specific groups involved. You've heard of the Pharisees, correct? Okay, you at least heard of these guys. Okay, so they were obviously the majority size group. They were the big party. Think of political parties. This is the biggest party in the country. Okay, they kind of have a dominating position. They believed that you had to follow the law of Moses. That's the Pentateuch. Okay, 5 Pentateuch, and that you had to follow the law as strictly as possible. The stricter, the better. And so they had, the hundreds of laws that were in the Old Testament that were under Moses. They ended up turning those into thousands of laws. Why? Because there were certain things that Moses didn't talk about. What do we do here? What do you mean by work? When he says you can't work on the Sabbath, what constitutes work? And so what did they do? We got to figure out how many steps that is. So they had lawyers and scribes to figure out and interpret the law so it could be followed in the strictest way possible. So that's why they came up with these rules like you can't pick up sticks, but you could pick up this many sticks on a Sabbath, because they didn't have those things spelled out in the Torah. They were gray areas. So what did they do? We got to come up with things to follow. And so they were the groups that came up with that. Now again, being that they were the strictest group when it came to reverence and following the law, they were not always looked down on. As we kind of look at them as the bad guys in the story of Scripture, they were not the bad guys. They were revered by people because of how strict they obeyed the law of God. So they were looked at as the holiest of the holy because of how strict they were. There wasn't too many people that were out there, making sure all of these things in their life were done just to the T, And so the common folk looked at them and said, wow, these are really like holy people. They are really focused on doing what God wants. And so we have a tendency to kind of, like I said, put them in this negative sense because they came in conflict with Jesus, which they did, and there was a lot of bad ones. But as a group, they were looked at positively by the culture. Okay, the party was well received. It was well respected. Okay, they had rabbis. You've probably heard of rabbis. It's just another word for teacher. They had gone through proper training in the law, so they had met with the scribes. Who, when I say scribe, I mean lawyer. So when your text says scribe, that's the lawyers of the day. These guys would walk around and they would have the lawyers with them because they would say, "What does the law say? What does the law say?" So imagine you go to court, today, the politicians are running around, they're kind of like the party, okay? And who do they have sitting behind them at all these committee meetings and stuff? All their lawyers. And have you ever watched the committee meetings in Congress where they have the guy, that they're grilling down there, and then all of the people are sitting up here and they're asking questions, and then at one point you'll see a guy from the back lean up and whisper something in the ear. That's the lawyers. They understand the rules. They know what the procedures are. They know what has to be done and where the law comes in. And these guys don't know it. They are not lawyers. Some of them used to be. But they're elected officials, and these guys are the experts with the law. So they reach up and they whisper stuff in their ear. Or they'll say, "Point of order." And then what happens? The chairman kind of goes, what do I do with this? And then the lawyer goes, and then he'll act. So if you watch it next time, you'll see that. It's the same setup. The Pharisees were the guys who were the ruling party, like that particular political group, and they had scribes running around with them all the time. And so if a person saw a scribe, they were very well regarded because they had to not only know what the law said per the written word, but they had to know all of the oral law, meaning what did this rabbi believe or how did he interpret this particular scripture? And so think case law. Lawyers have to do case law investigations. If you have some weird circumstance pop up and you go to your lawyer, the lawyer says, "Well, we have to get back to you on that." And then what do? They go out and they look if there's any statute. That's the written law. And if there's not any statute that just says, "Thou shalt not murder," they have to then go and look at cases from other judges, other lawyers, to figure out how they were ruled on. That's what the scribe's job was. What does this rabbi think of this particular thing? What does this rabbi think? And sometimes they would be at odds, and they would have to provide that information to the Pharisees, to the leaders, to make a proper assessment. Okay, that's kind of the political setup. So they had hundreds of laws. They turned it into thousands. They were obviously a revered group. The rabbis that were part of the Pharisees are kind of the guys that were sitting there. They would come up and read laws, and they would say this is how we would teach it. And they would have to go through proper training. They'd have to be approved to be a rabbi. You couldn't just be like a self-proclaimed rabbi. You had to go through proper Torah training, and you had to do all this stuff. And you had to be educated. In other words, you had to have the certificate that says that you got your doctorate or your master's or whatever, your bachelor's. They made sure that you were not just some random person running around there claiming you knew the law. The rabbis were respected. They were a part of the Pharisee party. Okay. Now, Pharisees aren't around anymore. Now you have the rabbinic group in Israel. In Judaism right now, if you were to go to Judaism, who runs Judaism? The rabbis. That's the Pharisee party. Just modern. It's not the Pharisees anymore. It's the rabbinic Judaism. It's all the rabbis. Okay? So it hasn't changed. It's just changed names to some degree. So in John 7:15, it says, "Then the Jews were astonished." They're talking about Jesus. "How does this man possess knowledge?" And what did they say? "Because he has not been taught." See, the Pharisees are sitting there and they're going, this guy has a knowledge of the word, of the Torah, and of, Moses' writing, and this guy hasn't been given a degree. Like, he doesn't have his bachelor's. He doesn't have his master's. He doesn't have his PhD. But he somehow understands the law. And they're baffled. Why are they baffled? Because in their culture, in their system, you had to go through the proper training to be a teacher. And here you have this guy show up, and he's never been through the teachings. He's never been through the training. He's never taken the classes. So let's talk about the law for just a second. So do you realize they have two laws that they look at? I think it's this way still today, but then they had two different kinds of laws. So you have the written law, which is what? Torah, Bible, first 5 books, the law of Moses, Leviticus and this stuff. But then you had the oral law. Oral law wasn't written down till later. This is what the rabbis and the teachers, when they were reading the written law, they would say, we have a gray area here. We don't have something definitive. So they would say, here's what we should do in these circumstances. And they would pass it down to their students. And the scribes and the lawyers' job was to memorize that so they could say, Rabbi so-and-so said this. And it became what they know as the oral law. That's how you take hundreds of laws written to thousands of laws oral. See? So Jesus got into battles with these guys because they had written law, but then they had turned written law into what? Oral law. It's like, well, this is how we understand it. Now think of it from our system. If you go to the Supreme Court, what they actually have is the 10 Commandments on the walls and on the doors of the Supreme Court. 10 rules, the law. And from those, every other law springs. And what do we have? Do we have too many laws in America? We have taken what was supposed to be these ones to just make sure, we think of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and what have we done with it? Turned it into thousands upon thousands upon thousands of laws. And if you want to know, can I get a permit to build a house out back or a shed, you can't just go and look it up anymore. You got to almost get a lawyer, and they got to find out what there is so many laws that you can't even swim through them anymore without getting totally overwhelmed, right? You got to call a legal scribe to come in and tell you what it means. It's not much different than then.
But we're trying to get rid of the Constitution.
Yeah, now they're trying to just get rid of the whole law. And so you can make whatever law you want, right? They didn't want to get rid of it in Judaism. They didn't want to get rid of it in Jesus' day, but they had expanded on it to such a degree that everybody had a say on what this meant, on how this should be done. And this is the world that Jesus is walking into, okay, to begin his ministry. It's no longer just as simple as the 5 books in the Old Testament, which really isn't that simple to begin with. It's been expanded. And these guys hold the keys to making it because they hold the oral law. The people were under the groups of rabbis that made up the different, we'll call them denominations, but the different groups in Israel, and then they had to decide, or how did they agree with that interpretation. Resurrection was a big one. This group didn't believe in it. This group did. You had to decide where you stood. And a lot of it came into, what party am I a part of? What's the party say?
Democrat or Republican.
Isn't it interesting that the 2 biggest parties in our country are what? The Democrats and the Republicans. And in this day, you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You know what's interesting is the Sadducees were a very conservative party and the Pharisees were a much more progressive party. Isn't that interesting? We'll see that as we go through this. You'll see some of the things. Who was in charge during Jesus' day? The Pharisees. Much more progressive party. Because when we get to the temple next week, and maybe it might even take us 2 weeks, you're going to see how the Pharisee party with the Sanhedrin and the chief priests basically ran the show, and they were able to manipulate the law because of their hundreds to thousands. They found loopholes in everything. So they could do what they wanted to do by getting around here and calling it legal. Does that not happen today? Your minds are going to go, wow, this is America. Like, it looks like America. So the Jews encountered many instances in which the written law didn't speak, and so that's when you had to have oral law. What rabbi, what do you think? And the rabbi would come in and tell them, and they would say, let's remember that. And that would be the oral law. Okay, that's what they call the oral law. The leaders therefore passed down the oral law over centuries in an effort to address these issues not outlined by Moses. So they took it from hundreds to thousands. And this is actually in modern rabbinic Judaism. So if you were to go over there today and say, what's the oral law? That's what they call the Mishnah. So if you've ever heard of the Mishnah, that's the oral law. They eventually wrote it down. It was orally passed until eventually someone says, we probably should write this stuff down. And so they did. In the Mishnah. That's what they have today. So if you go over today, they still have the written law, the Torah, but they have the oral law, the Mishnah. And that's what they use to determine how to conduct themselves, what should be done and what can't be done, what should be done. It's the Mishnah. The oral law or the Mishnah deals with ritual purity rather than spiritual purity. What do I have to do to be ritually acceptable, to be able to go into these places and participate in these events and activities? So there's spiritual purity, how am I before God? And then there's ritual purity, how can I participate in the events of society? The Mishnah, the oral law, dealt with what do I have to do? They would connect the two, obviously. Cleanliness, you've heard the joke, cleanliness next to godliness, right? They would say you have to be clean before you can come and give your sacrifice and come into the temple area and do these things. So a lot of these had to do with what you do to be clean, to be ritually pure. They did this, many of them, to counter Roman culture. Roman culture was pagan. They didn't have any rules really on how you behave hardly at all. When it came to, it was not compatible with Judaism. And so what did they do? We've got to figure out how to conduct in a manner that we can counter some of that. We can still be our own unique culture that reflects differently than our occupiers. Because who's running the culture right now? The Romans. The Romans are there. So many Pharisees did not care for the common people. Surprise, surprise. Because they couldn't keep the purity laws due to the fact that they had to work and live in ways that didn't allow them to keep it as perfectly as they did. So in other words, the common man who was out there working in the fields or working with the fish or working at the cemetery or whatever, a lot of the Pharisees did not have any care for them because they couldn't keep the law like they could. And it wasn't because they didn't want to. The common man didn't want it. It was because the common man was too busy working to be a full-time Pharisee lawkeeper. Now think of it from today. Who do the Pharisees represent in our culture? Probably the political party, okay? And do they give a lot of regard for the common man? Why? Because we don't see things the way they do. We don't do things the way they do. We're too busy working to go do the things that they're doing. How many times have you been like, you should run for office? Well, I would love to, but I have a family to take care of. And these people, the common people, had to work their tails off to just survive in this culture. You got Roman taxes, you've got temple taxes, you've got all these things happening in their culture, and the common person's going, I can't not pick up sticks on this day. So they might be ritually unclean or in violation of that. They were constantly just trying to survive. And so the Pharisees looked at them and said, we look down on you because of that. You're not ritually focused on trying to maintain purity. And a lot of them just couldn't do it. They didn't have the ability to do it because of their life. Common folk. It created a gap between the ruling class and the common man. Sound familiar? The common man or woman wasn't able to live as the Pharisees in such a strict manner, so this divide popped in. It formed in between them. And so the Pharisees actually, I put this phrase, people of the land, because it was a derogatory term that the Pharisees was used to talk about the common people. The people of the land. You see, we're not people of the land. We're in here keeping strict cleanliness laws, and these people are out there rolling around in the dirt. They're nothing like us. We're the ruling class. They're the common folk. And instead of having a care for them as this political party overseeing them, what did they do? They despised them. They were involved in a lot of stuff, and I want to differentiate the groups because you have the Pharisees, which is the political party, but then we have the priests, including the chief priests that ran the temple. They could be part of the Pharisees, but you have to remember that's their political party. That's kind of their interpretation party. But they're still the chief priests, and you have the Levites, and you have the chief priests. Then you have the Sanhedrin. These are all different groups that are either a member of the Sadducees or the Pharisees. So think about our government and how it's set up. You have Republicans and Democrats, but you have the House, and you have, this particular, or you have the president, chief priest will say. Okay, that might be a stretch, but we'll call it that. But they're also a part of a specific party. Follow me? So we just think Pharisees. Pharisees, that's just the bad guys. No, the Pharisees were the party. And there was all these groups and people groups that made up the party. Okay? So that's the difference. So the common people, to go back to this gap that existed, the common people were many times discouraged because they're out there working their tails off. They didn't have the time to go or the ability to go. They weren't born into a wealthy family of nobility. And so what could they just stop what they were doing and leave their family and say, I'm going to go take it and get a 4-year degree and then get my master's and my PhD so I can go run for and be a part of the Pharisee party or become a lawyer? No, they couldn't do that. They had to work.
Would they like to have done that?
I think a lot of them would have because it was prestigious.
Oh, okay.
It was prestigious. I mean, think about it today. If you go to a Ivy League school, this is how it used to be. I don't know if it's exactly today. I'm probably talking to the wrong crowd for this. If I was downtown New York, we were sitting at an Ivy League conference and we had all these people with PhDs from Princeton and stuff. They're going to be the ones that everybody goes, oh my goodness. They're just so revered because they've done that. Now, we may not do that here. I don't really, you tell me you have an Ivy League college degree, I'm going to be like, that's a strike right now, right? But in this culture, that was, I mean, think about it. There's a lot of people that value that. When they they read your credentials and you've been this scribe and this lawyer, been to this school, you studied under this rabbi and you did this, it gave them this like, wow, this is somebody. And then here comes Jesus, right? And this guy comes from, well, we're going to talk. Here he is. He's born in a common family. Wrong side of the tracks family, actually. Nazareth was, does anything good come from there, remember?
Yeah.
That's only one of his disciples was like, really? He was a carpenter by trade. He had to work to take care of his mom, is what most scholars believe, because they think his dad died when he was very young. Why is Joseph never mentioned in the New Testament? Beyond basically the birth of Jesus. They think he died. So here's Jesus with his mom, who's a widow. They had other kids, obviously. But he might have been just trying to take care of his brothers and sisters and his mom. And so what did he do? He took on his dad's trade, and he became a carpenter. And he worked to take care of them. Now that is not the ruling class beginnings. And God knew this when he came. He didn't say, I'm going to be born into a family of the Pharisees and go to the best colleges and get the Ivy League degree. What did he do? Born in a barn to a nobody family with now him having to work in his youth. I mean, remember, he doesn't start his ministry until he's 30. He's working as a kid all the way up to 30 as a carpenter to just take care of his family. Be a part of his family. Probably take care of his mom and his siblings.
But he never sinned.
He never sinned, that's true. But think of that, like that's a man of the people. He's a common person who's had to work. And God did that on purpose. I didn't come to be a part of the ruling class. I came to be a part of the common man. So he was a carpenter by trade. Now what's interesting is he was what we would call a self-promoted teacher or rabbi, but he hadn't gone through the proper Pharisee training. So he comes in and he starts teaching, and has he been to the Ivy League schools? He has not. He hasn't gone through any of the Sadducee training, Pharisee training. He hasn't been through any of the classes. He might have been through like basic school, but that's where it ended. And here all of a sudden, he's saying, I'm going to get some guys and they're going to follow me. I'm going to have my disciples. And they're going, no, 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 no. That's not how this works. You got to go through the proper training. You got to be properly approved by the class. And then you can have your disciples and do this. And here Jesus comes in and he says, I'm not doing any of that. He was known to eat with and company the people whom the Pharisees rejected due to ritual purity and cleanliness laws. So the people that, remember, the people of the land, they were always like, no, you stay away from them. They're beneath us. It's like a politician coming out and spending time in Kersey. Probably isn't going to happen. But that's the kind of thing that Jesus was like, those are actually the people I'm going to go to. I'm going to go have dinner with them. I'm going to go out and talk to them. I'm going to go out and visit with them. That was his platform that he began. And why? Because that's where his roots were. That's who his heart was after. He recognized the neglect. And so he went to them. He was known as a man of and for the people rather than the establishment ruling class. Isn't that interesting? When the society looked at Jesus, they looked at him and he was the opposite of Pharisees and these guys. Now, when you think about, he ran obviously into a lot of conflicts with the Pharisees because of the things that we just listed. But think about our current political climate. You can say what you want about Donald Trump, which he's definitely not a perfect man. But for whatever reason, the vast majority of what we would call the people of the land like him. Why?
Because he's like
He
us.
seems to want to go and represent them. I mean, he was in the Bronx this week and had around 20,000 people show up when they thought he might have like 3,500 in a really deep blue state. And they were interviewing people. I was listening to the interviews, and they were just asking people that are like, they're Democratic Party people, and they're like, he just acts like he cares about us, like he actually wants what's best for us. And they're going like, it's interesting how, I'm not comparing Donald Trump to Jesus by any means, okay? Don't get me wrong here. But the process of who you represent seems to matter, doesn't it? The class in which you want to come in and represent seems to have an impact. Now, here's the problem, is that Jesus is born into this circumstance, and he goes to the common people. In the very last line, he ran into conflict with the Pharisees because of it. When he tried to represent the people, and going to them, what did the ruling class do? They hated him for it. They hated him for trying to involve the little man in the bigger picture. Look at this in Luke. And when he was 12 years old, Jesus, he went up according to the custom of the feast. Remember, they go to Jerusalem? And it happened that after 3 days, this is when he was like, mom and dad are panicking because they can't find him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting in the midst of the teachers and listening to them and asking them questions. All he did was just go to Jerusalem. He goes to the temple. He's 12 years old, and what is he doing? He's just sitting there listening. He's trying to learn. And guess what? He didn't have any formal teaching. He didn't go through Pharisee class. He didn't get his 4-year degree and his master's and PhD. Not that those things are bad. But what did he do? He just went and wanted to learn. And you notice it's interesting because at the end of Luke in verse 52, it says, and Jesus was advancing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with people. It wasn't like he dumped himself empty. He's still God, but he's still man. And so what did he do? He had to learn. We think I had a student one time ask me, say, did Jesus know how to do quantum physics? I'm like, well, yes, from a God standpoint, he's the inventor of that. But when he became a man, he emptied himself and had to learn. And so I don't think Jesus could have done quantum physics at 30 years old. He might have from the God standpoint, but from the man standpoint, he still had to learn. Why is he here? Why in the temple at 12 years old learning? If he's God. See, he went through the same process of learning, of going and absorbing, asking questions, and he's trying to put it together, and he has the Holy Spirit, though, that's guiding and putting all these things in place, plus he's God. So he's got the perfect situation to learn. But it wasn't like it just, there it is. So we're going to play a quick game. Now, you're going to play a game this morning. So here's the rules. So we're going to look at a number of passages, just a few of them, but I want you, based on what we just discussed about Jesus and the Pharisees, okay, the conflict that they had, you have to identify the point of conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees in each of these passages. What's the issue that they're at odds on? Okay? It's not hard. No, it's not hard. Okay, here's one. Let's look at Matthew 15. In summoning the crowd, he said to them, hear and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. Then the disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? And he answered and said, every plant that my heavenly Father did not plant will be uprooted. Let them. They are blind guides of the blind, and if the blind guide the blind, both will fall into a pit. Now, the end party just lets them have it. But go back to the top part about this whole defilement piece. What's the issue?
It's a matter of the heart.
The cleanliness of food that goes into your body, right? From Pharisee party, how do you stay clean? Eat kosher. Make sure that it is not defiled. These are the foods that are not okay to eat, right? Jesus comes along and says, what? It has nothing to do with the food that you eat. And they have a problem. Remember, party of thousands of rules, strictest adherence to oral and written law, and this guy comes in and throws a landmine in it and goes, has nothing to do with what you eat. See the point of conflict? Here's another one. Peter answered and said to him, explain this parable to us. But he said, are you still without understanding? Do you not understand that everything that enters into the mouth goes into the stomach and is evacuated into the latrine? I love that. But the things that came out of the mouth come from the heart, and these defile the person. For from the heart come evil plans, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, abusive speech. These are the things that defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile a person. What's the point of conflict? Wash your hands is what the Pharisees are saying. That will make you clean. And Jesus comes along and says your hands can be super clean and you can still be totally dirty. And they're going, problem. There's another one. Behold, a leper approached and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you are able to make me clean. And extending his hand, he, Jesus, touched him, saying, I'm willing, be clean. What's the problem?
Do not touch anyone with leprosy.
He touched the guy.
Way below.
Pharisees, no, you cannot touch this guy. You have to wait until he comes to the priest and presents himself clean, and when he goes through the proper ritual, and we can confirm it through the legal process, we'll declare him clean, and then he's back into society. And here Jesus comes along, and the guy says, I just want to be clean, and what happens? He just says, done. There's another one. It happened that on that next day he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. And as he approached the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, do not weep. And he came up and he touched the bier, and those who were carrying it stopped. And he said, young man, I say to you, get up. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and he gave him to his mother. Okay, what's the problem? Pharisee Jesus.
Resurrection.
You don't touch a dead body or the thing they're laying on.
Yeah.
Because that's a cleanliness issue. That's a ritual impurity issue. And what does Jesus say? This lady's crying. It's her only son. And what does he do? He walks up. He says, well, slow down. He stops him. Get up. And the guy wakes up. Been dead, Gets up. That's a big no-no. Big no-no. The man went and reported to the Jews that Jesus was the one who made him well. This is another account. And on account of this, the Jews began to persecute Jesus because he was doing things on the Sabbath. What's the point of conflict? I don't care what it is. The Sabbath, you don't do that. The work, healing people, that's a Sabbath thing. Guess where that's written? Oral law. That's came up by the leaders. No, you can't do that on the Sabbath. You can't do any of these things. And Jesus comes along and says, it's better to heal this guy. Remember he uses the phrase, if your animal falls into a pit on Sunday, do you leave it to die or do you get it out? No, you're going to get it out. He uses the illustration. And so there's another conflict. He touches people he shouldn't touch. He does things at times he shouldn't do them. This guy's not properly trained. He's never been through our classes. He's not got the degree that we approved of. He's not a part of our political party. And what happens? We have a problem. This guy's a problem. There's another one. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to hear him. In fact, he had a lot of dinners with them at times. Matthew, in fact, was one of his disciples who was a tax collector. And so what's the conflict? Based on what you know. No, this is the people of the land, and the tax collectors are the worst of the worst because they work for the Romans collecting taxes, and they're Jewish, so they're just after us. And so they're the worst of the people of the land. And who's Jesus running around having dinner with? That isn't because he approves of their theft or approves of their sin. It's because they, as he said, need a healer when everybody else says they're the people of the land. They're beneath us. They're worthless. He went to people rather than putting himself above them. Here's another one. They came bringing him a paralytic carried by 4 of them, and when they were not able to bring him to him because of the crowd, they removed the roof where he was, and after digging through, they lowered the stretcher on which the paralytic was lying, and when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, child, your sins are forgiven. Uh-oh, what's the conflict? Only God can forgive sin, and you're a self-proclaimed, uneducated, rabbi with a bunch of common people following you around. And now you're claiming that you can just forgive people? You're putting yourself above the other rabbis?
Equal with God.
Problem. The Pharisees' view, Jesus was ritually impure. He was claiming the ability to do things rabbis don't do. You don't touch people. You definitely don't forgive sins. You don't touch dead bodies. This is part of being a Pharisee. Remember, they're the strictest enforcers and followers of the written and oral law. And people attributed that to greatness before God. If I follow all these things strictly, then somehow God is approved. And that's what they taught. Now, fast forward. Paul comes into the picture, and he was one of those guys. And what does he say?
That stuff doesn't matter.
Yeah, he says, I consider it all trash compared to Christ. So he was a convert. He was the Ivy League school guy who said, it's better to be out in the field than it is to be in the ivory tower. That's the beauty of Paul. And obviously, he had an encounter with Christ that changed that for him. So what was Jesus' view? Well, the Pharisees had emphasized the act and the work over the person's soul. Their soul and the others. You'd rather strictly follow stuff rather than actually care for people. You'd rather strictly follow stuff and have a mess internally.
Sometimes it's easier.
It is easier to follow laws because you can just check them off and then go do whatever you want. And Jesus isn't interested in that. He wants the heart. He doesn't want you to just follow a bunch of rules and call it good for the day. So they lacked the very heart of God, which is what Jesus wanted from his people. And so he wanted them to have that. And so he said, you can follow the laws as strictly as you want, but really what matters is the heart. And so he came into conflict with them. Here's the issues that were brewing. Jesus was a self-described teacher and rabbi, but he wasn't approved. Remember, you had to go through the classes. You had to get the degree. He didn't have it. Jesus interacted with the people that the rabbis and Pharisees were to avoid. You have nothing to do with them. They were looked down on. They were despised. They were the common people. Jesus didn't tolerate loopholes in the law that the Pharisees embraced. I'm going to show you that in just a second. But they would find ways around the law to do what they wanted, and he called them out on it. Quit using the law to do what you want. It's supposed to be done this way. This is what it means. Quit manipulating it for your own agenda. Does that not happen today? Jesus had a problem with hypocrisy, of which the Pharisees exhibited clearly before the people. Jesus didn't like God's name used with something that didn't reflect him. They put God's name on it, and it absolutely was the opposite of God's character. He didn't like that. Look at this one. This is the loophole. Woe to you, blind guides, he's talking to the Pharisees, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it's nothing. In other words, if you made an oath on the temple, they'd let you out of it. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by the oath. See their loophole? The rule was you don't swear by anything. And they would find ways to say, you swear by the temple? We can find ways around that. But definitely not the gold, because the wealth of the temple is the most important part, right? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites, because you pay a tenth of mint and dill and cumin. In other words, you got the tithing down by the book and neglect the more important matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. It was necessary to do these things while not neglecting those. Blind guides who filter out a gnat and swallow a camel. What did they do? They found loopholes to make it look like everything was really good. But in the end, they violated the ultimate spirit of the law. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. So they look really good. Got their suits on, sitting in the most prestigious chairs, but internally they're evil. They're wicked. They have no moral guidance that matters, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the blood of the prophets. What do? They go get the people they revere in society, the religious, the Billy Grahams, and what do? They put statues up for them, and they have these ceremonies. But then what do? They would have been the ones out there after them all the time. They want the prestige in the following of the religious, but internally, do they care? No. In fact, they're a problem internally. A leader that comes along and wants the Christian vote, and so what do? Oh, I'm a Christian. You have something. Here's the X factor. This is the thing that caused the problem that kind of was the dividing point. Matt kind of hit this. Jesus could do miracles. And there's a problem with this. Because the people, he would say something, and then he had the ability to do something that violated not only the laws of nature, by the way, watch me walk on water. That doesn't work in physics, And so he could do things. And so now they were faced with something, a question. Is this divinity or is this demonic? And what did the Pharisees come to the conclusion of? It's demonic. It's demonic. So even when the guy could do things, even when Jesus could do stuff to back up his claims that no one could explain, they said, well, he's got to be doing it by the devil rather than by God. And why is that? He hasn't been through the training. He hasn't been through the proper procedures. He doesn't follow our written and oral laws. He doesn't seem to care about the things we care about. So the conclusion they came to is, if he does anything miraculous, it has to be from the devil because God wouldn't have that be that way. One particular miracle was the beginning of the end for Jesus' earthly ministry. Now remember, we're approaching the Passion Week and we're getting ready for the Passion. What was it that ultimately led to his downfall? This is it. This is a big problem. Did you know that in Orthodox Christianity they actually celebrate the day of Lazarus? They celebrate when he was raised. It's called the Saturday of Lazarus. It's the day before Palm Sunday. And there's a place on the road where Mary met Jesus on the way to Bethany that's called the Lazarium, and there's a church there. And they go in and they read scripture and they sing hymns on the day that Lazarus was resurrected. You remember the burial, you had to bury someone the same day. It was really hot. So you had to get the body in the ground or in a tomb. And so they typically buried someone the same day. So Lazarus dies and they're like, we got to get him buried. And so that's what they did. Now you had a mourning that began as soon as he died. No social activities, no leaving your house unless you were going to the tomb. And it was like that for 7 days. You couldn't even comb your hair. You couldn't wear shoes. A lot of times they'd sprinkle dust and ashes on their body to kind of look like death warmed over, mourning. 7 days you had to live like that. 7. And then after that, you had 30 days where you would be able to kind of do some things, but you weren't totally done with your mourning for 30 days. And if a kid lost a parent, they had to do the 30-day thing for actually an entire year. Mourning was a big deal. It was a ritual type thing to mourn for the dead. So Jesus shows up 4 days after Lazarus is in the tomb. Jewish tradition, oral law, claimed the soul remained in the body for 3 days. You think that was by coincidence Jesus shows up on day 4? Because a rabbi could show up and say, well, he's still there, and maybe we have some ability to get him to wake up. But Jesus says, no, we're going to wait till day 4. Because at that time, where would his soul have been? In Hades, in Sheol. And then Jesus shows up, and what does he do? Come out. And he comes out. And this is in defiance of everything they understood legally, supernaturally, because the spirit shouldn't have been there anymore. It should have been in Sheol. And here this guy has the ability to get it from Sheol back to the body. What is it? I mean, this miracle is huge. This isn't just any old miracle. Not that any of them were, but this is a big one. Because it had theological implications. So, question, what kind of Jewish Pharisee problems have to be addressed now? Here's just a few of them. Is the family considered unclean for touching a dead body?
Yes.
But he's alive. He's not actually dead. So now how do we deal with that from a legal standpoint? Is he actually alive or is he dead? Well, he was dead. Is their mourning complete?
But he's no longer dead.
He's not dead, so you'd think the mourning was be over, but that's not what the law says. A person dies, what are you supposed to do? Are those who were exposed to Lazarus at the tomb ritually unclean? Could they go back to church on Sunday even though he walked out of the tomb alive? How does the law and the rules deal with a man who was dead 4 days and is now alive? Actually, now we thought the soul was gone and now it's back. How do we deal with this theologically? You see all the problems Jesus caused in the Pharisee community, in the Sadducee community, in the whole Jewish community by his theological implications of what he just did? Ritual laws violated, apparently. We don't even know how to ritually handle this now. We thought he was in Sheol. Apparently he can come back after 4 days. We got to rewrite that in the law. This is the last one that we're going to stop. So you had this group called the Great Sanhedrin. You've heard of the Sanhedrin. Consisted of Pharisees, the lawyers, the chief priests, and the elders of the people. So the elders were just like the rich people. They might have been landowners. The chief priests are the ones of the tribe of Levi. We talked about the lawyers, and the Pharisees are the party. Okay? 70 of them. Most prominent men from the region. They were authorized by the Romans, and so they had the ability to decide what happened. Now, this group did not just exist in Israel and have influence. Remember, the diaspora is the Jews being scattered. This is because of Nebuchadnezzar. They're gone to all these different nations. They're still in a lot of these places. They still want to know what the Sanhedrin's saying. It's like if you want to know what the U.S. is deciding and you're living overseas in Russia or whatever. They still had to keep track. So they had a far-reaching. And so that's why they had to make sure the Romans, because they were the power party, got their taxes, so they stayed in power. And so they were the supreme court of the Jewish people. You didn't take every case to them, only the biggest ones. And so because of this, not only were they the executive branch, but they made the laws, and they were the judicial branch. They were all three in one group, 70 guys, the Great Sanhedrin. Look at this. Then many of the Jews who had come with Mary and saw the things which he did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called together the Sanhedrin and said, "What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we allow him to go on this way, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." We've got to have a meeting. But a certain one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest in the year, said to them, "You do not know anything at all, nor do you consider that it is profitable for you that one man should die for the people and the whole nation not perish." The Lazarus event led to a call of the Sanhedrin, which led the chief priest in that meeting to say, we have to make a decision now. This guy's messing up our theology. He's setting the system on fire. We have to kill him. He has to go. It's better he die than the nation go down.
They're afraid for their positions.
And their position, their power. That's right. So what does it all mean? There's a gap between the ruling class and the people. That exists. Jesus arrives and he stands against the ruling class so he can show real care and give the truth to the actual people of the land. The ruling class feels threatened at the support and the work of this man, and the ruling class concludes the only option which keeps them in power is to eliminate him. Does that not sound like today? Like 100% what's going on today? Why does the establishment feel so threatened by those who embrace the realities and the simple truths of God? Anybody follow Harris Butker this week, the guy for the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs?
Yeah,
He came out with traditional view at a speech, and they just have tried to destroy his entire life. The establishment doesn't like it. Why does the establishment feel as though the only option is to destroy?
They're afraid.
I think I found it. What can be known about God is evident among them, for God made it clear to them. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who practices evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds be exposed. I put an emphasis on that.
Yeah.
I want to read this to you, and then I'll let you go. C.S. Lewis has a chapter 8 in his book, Mere Christianity, called The Great Sin. It says, "I have heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or that they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think I have ever heard anyone who is not a Christian accuse himself of this vice. And at the same time, I have very seldom met anyone who was not a Christian who showed the slightest mercy to it in others. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I'm talking of is pride and self-conceit, and the virtue opposite it is in Christian morals is called humility. Then he says this, now what you want to get clear is that pride is essentially competitive. It is competitive by its very nature, while the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone. That is why I say that pride is essentially competitive in a way that the other vices are not. It is pride, the wish to be richer than some other rich man, and still more the wish for power. For of course, power is what pride really enjoys. There is nothing make a man feel so superior to others as to be able to move them about like toy soldiers. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Other vices may sometimes bring people together. You may find good fellowship and jokes and friendliness among drunken people or unchaste people, but pride always means enmity, and it is enmity. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, all of that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind.